The elevator doors were closing when a barefoot boy grabbed the Korean billionaire's sleeve and hissed four words that stopped his heart. "Don't move. Follow me." Seconds later, the elevator he should have boarded plunged 11 floors, screaming steel and shattered glass, and the man realized a street child had just seen his death before it happened, and somehow stepped between him and fate itself. Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe, telling me where you are watching from. Kang Min-ho had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether to trust a stranger with dust on his knees and terror in his eyes, or to step into the elevator car gliding open before him with a soft, polite chime. He chose the boy. He would spend the rest of his life grateful that he had. The Seoul morning outside the Hansol Tower glittered with a kind of cold, indifferent beauty, glass towers catching the sun, businessmen moving like clockwork, steam rising from coffee carts. Min-ho, 34 years old and worth more than most small nations, had walked this lobby 1,000 times without looking at anyone in it. That morning, for reasons he could not explain even to himself later, he looked at the boy sitting cross-legged near the revolving doors, selling folded paper cranes for 1,001 each. The boy's name was Kwame. He was 12, though hunger had shaved years off his frame and added decades to his eyes. He had come to Korea 2 years earlier with his mother, who cleaned offices in this very building until the day she didn't come home from her shift. Kwame had learned to survive on watching which security guards looked away, which doors stayed unlocked, which people's faces changed a half-second before they lied. That morning, he had watched a man in a gray suit press the elevator call button, then quietly unscrew something from the panel behind the potted ficus while no one was looking. Kwame did not know what a shorted brake relay was, but he knew what it looked like when someone did something they didn't want seen. "Sir," Kwame's voice cracked as he stepped in front of Min-ho. "Don't move, follow me." Min-ho, mid-stride, phone already halfway to his ear, glanced down with the practiced dismissal of a man who received 40 requests for money a day. Then he saw the boy's eyes, not begging, not performing, afraid. Genuinely, urgently afraid, the way people are afraid for someone else. "Excuse me," Min-ho said. "That elevator," Kwame said, pointing without turning his head as if the man in gray might still be watching. "Don't get in, please." There was no time for explanation. The doors chimed shut behind Minho's would-be step, the number one lit green, and the car began its ascent toward the executive floor where Minho had a 9 a.m. meeting with his company's largest investor. 12 seconds later, on the 8th floor, the cable assembly failed. The car dropped 4 stories before the emergency brakes caught, hard enough to shatter the interior paneling and injure the 2 people who had stepped in a breath after Minho would have. Min-ho stood in the lobby amid the screaming and the sprinting security guards, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears, staring at the boy who had just saved his life and was now trying to slip away into the chaos, invisible again, the way survival had taught him to be. Min-ho caught his wrist. "Wait. I didn't do anything," Kwame said quickly. "I just guessed." "You don't guess a thing like that?" Min-ho's voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You saw something, tell me what." Kwame hesitated. In his experience, telling adults what he saw got him nothing but disbelief or worse, attention from the wrong people. But this man's hand on his wrist wasn't rough. It was steady, like he was holding on to something he didn't want to lose. "A man," Kwame said finally, "gray suit. He did something to the panel by the plant before you came in." Minho's eyes moved past the boy to the ficus near the revolving doors, now surrounded by police tape and confused office workers. Whoever the man in gray was, he was long gone. But the detail was too specific, too strange to be a lucky guess from a child hopping for a reward. "What's your name?" Minho asked. "Kwame." "Kwame," Minho said it like he was memorizing something important. "I owe you my life, that is not a small thing to me." Kwame shook his head, pulling gently against the grip, already calculating exits, already bracing for the moment kindness turned into another kind of danger. "You don't owe me anything, I have to go." But Minho did not let go, and something in the boy's exhausted, watchful face made him ask the question that would unravel the next several months of both their lives. "Where is your mother, Kwame?" The boy went very still. The security chief of Hansol Tower, a heavy-set man named Park, arrived breathless and apologetic, already speaking of investigations and liability and the terrible, terrible accident. Minho listened with half his attention, the other half locked on the boy who was watching Park's mouth move with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to a stranger's small talk. You said the man unscrewed something, Minho said quietly once Park had been pulled away by a colleague. Could you describe him? Quame's throat worked, tall, Korean, he had a scar here, he touched his own eyebrow. And he wore a company badge but it was upside down like he didn't want the picture showing. Minho filed the detail away with the same cold precision he used when reading a balance sheet for fraud because that was, in fact, exactly what his instincts were telling him this was. Sabotage disguised as accident, and an accident meant for him. Come with me, Minho said, just for an hour, I want to understand what happened. After that, if you want to go, no one will stop you. Quame looked at the wreckage being cordoned off behind them, then at the crisp, unreadable calm of the man beside him, and made the kind of decision that street children make 100 times a day and are rarely thanked for. He decided, cautiously, to trust. They did not go to Minho's office. Instead, Minho took Quame to a quiet noodle shop 2 blocks away from cameras and colleagues, where he ordered more food than one boy could possibly eat and watched with something tightening in his chest how carefully Quame ate, like someone who had learned that meals were never guaranteed to continue. Tell me about your mother, Minho said again, gently this time. Quame's chopsticks paused over the bowl. She worked here in this building, cleaning offices at night, his voice thinned. She didn't come home one night 6 months ago. The police said she probably went back to Ghana without telling anyone, but she wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave without me. Minho, who had spent his adult life learning to read the difference between grief and performance, saw only grief in the boy's face. Did anyone investigate? They said there was nothing to investigate, no body, no evidence, just a missing woman with no family here to make noise about it. Quame's jaw tightened. Nobody makes noise for people like us. Something cold moved through Minho, unrelated to the elevator, unrelated to the sabotage, or perhaps he thought entirely related. He did not yet know how, but the instinct that had built his company from nothing told him these 2 facts, a missing cleaner and an attempt on his own life in the same building, were not unconnected threads. They were the same thread pulled from 2 different ends. I want to help you find her, Minho said. And I want to find out who tried to kill me this morning. I have a feeling those 2 things are going to lead to the same door. Quame looked up at him, searching his face the way he searched every adult's face for the flicker of a lie. He found none. Only the tired, focused calm of a man who had just survived death and decided, in its wake, not to waste the life he'd been given. Why would you help me? Quame asked. You don't know me. Because this morning, Minho said, you were the only person in that entire building who saw me, really saw me, and decided I was worth saving. I intend to return the favor. Neither of them could have known in that quiet noodle shop with steam curling between them, that this single decision, one boy's warning, one man's gratitude, would unravel a conspiracy that stretched from a cleaning company's falsified employee records to a boardroom coup years in the making. A conspiracy that had already claimed one life and was patiently, quietly preparing to claim more. That afternoon, Minho canceled every meeting on his calendar for the first time in 6 years. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Han Ariam, stood in his office doorway with a stack of files and barely concealed alarm. Sir. The D-Sung investors are still waiting downstairs, and the police want a statement about the elevator. Give the police whatever they need, Minho said, not looking up from the laptop where he was pulling employee records for Hansol Tower's cleaning contractor. Tell the investors I'll reschedule. And Ariam, find me everything you can on a cleaning company called Chinji Services. Payroll records, contracts, employee rosters going back at least 2 years. Ariam hesitated. May I ask why? Minho finally looked up and something in his expression made her forget the question. Someone tried to kill me this morning. I intend to find out who, and I have reason to believe it isn't unrelated to a woman who used to work in this building and vanished 6 months ago. That got her full attention, the police report. There isn't one, not really, a missing persons file with no follow-up filed by a coworker closed within a month for lack of evidence. Minho's jaw tightened. That's not an investigation, that's a building being cleared of a problem. Quame sat in the corner of the vast office, small against the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching this transformation with something between disbelief and cautious hope. He had spent 2 years learning that adults with power rarely spent it on people like him. This man was already spending his. By evening, Ariam returned with a folder that made Minho go very quiet. Shinji Services employee roster showed a woman named Ajoa Mensah, Quame's mother, terminated for job abandonment the same week she disappeared. But buried in the payroll metadata was a timestamp anomaly. Her final paycheck had been processed and collected 2 weeks after her disappearance by someone using her employee ID at an ATM 3 districts away. Someone used your mother's card after she vanished, Minho said carefully, watching the boy's face for how much truth he could bear at once. That doesn't mean the worst, but it means someone knows more than they've said. Quame's hands curled into fists in his lap, but his voice when it came was steady in a way that surprised even Minho. Then we find them. Later that night, long after Ariam had gone home and the tower had emptied into darkness, Minho sat across from Quame at the small table in his private office kitchen, 2 cups of untouched tea between them. You should sleep, Minho said. There's a guest room, you'll be safe here. I've been safe alone for 2 years, Quame said, not unkindly, just factually. I don't know how to be safe with someone watching. Minho considered this with the same seriousness he gave every difficult problem. Then let's practice. Tonight I'll just be in the next room, nothing more. Quame studied him for a long moment, this rich, composed man who had cancelled his empire for an afternoon because a street child grabbed his sleeve and felt something shift cautiously in his chest. Not trust yet, but the beginning of the possibility of it. Okay, Quame said, just for tonight. Neither of them slept much. Minho lay awake replaying the sabotaged elevator panel, the upside-down badge, the scarred man who had vanished into Seoul's crowds without a trace. Quame lay awake in an unfamiliar bed, listening to the hum of a building 60 floors above the ground, wondering if the answer to his mother's disappearance had been sitting 6 floors above her mop bucket the entire time, in an office belonging to a man who cleaned up more than floors. By morning, both of them had made the same private decision, though neither said it aloud. This was no longer about one attempted murder or one missing woman. It was about everything Shinji Services and whoever stood behind it had been quietly cleaning away. The next morning, Minho called the one person in Seoul he trusted with things that couldn't go through official channels, a private investigator named Baek Do-hyun, a former financial crimes detective who had left the police force after discovering his own department was protecting the wrong people. Do-hyun arrived at Hansal Tower in a rumpled coat, looking less like a security consultant and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in years, and listened to the entire story without interrupting once. Sabotaged elevator, missing cleaner, falsified payroll, Do-hyun summarized when Minho finished. You understand what this smells like. Tell me anyway. Someone inside Shinji Services or someone controlling it is covering tracks. The kind of tracks people leave when they're moving money or moving bodies or both. Do-hyun glanced at Quame, who sat rigid and listening in the corner. I'm sorry, son, I know that's hard to hear. I've heard worse, Quame said quietly. I just never heard anyone say it out loud before. Do-hyun's expression softened just slightly. Then let's find out who's been keeping it quiet. Over the following days, Do-hyun pulled threads that the police had never bothered to touch. Shinji Services, it turned out, was not an independent cleaning contractor at all, but a shell company owned through 2 layers of paper subsidiaries by a holding firm called Isol Group, an Isol Group's silent majority shareholder, buried under a nominee director's name, traced back to a man Minho knew very well. Jung Tae-sik, his late father's former business partner, the man who had quietly, patiently opposed Minho's rise to CEO for the past 6 years, always with a smile, always with plausible deniability, always positioned one step behind the throne he clearly believed should have been his. That's not proof, Do-hyun warned, watching Minho's face harden. Owning a shell company that owns a cleaning contractor isn't a confession. Men like Jung build walls between themselves and consequences for exactly this reason. Then we find what's behind the wall, Minho said. That night, for the first time since his mother vanished, Quame let himself cry not in front of Minho, but in the quiet of the guest room, muffled into a pillow that smelled of a life he had never imagined having access to. When Minho knocked softly and asked if he could come in, Quame did not send him away. We're going to find her, Minho said, sitting carefully at the edge of the bed, keeping distance, keeping it safe. Whatever the answer is, you deserve to know it. What if the answer is the worst one? Quame's voice cracked. Minho did not offer empty comfort. Then I will make sure whoever did it never hurts anyone else's mother again, that I can promise you. It was not a hug, it was not a declaration. But it was the first time in 2 years someone had made Quame a promise and looked like they intended to keep it, and something in the boy's chest, guarded for so long it had calcified, cracked open just slightly toward hope. A few days later, Du Haiyan returned with something that changed the shape of the investigation entirely. Security footage, quietly obtained from a pawnshop 3 districts from Hansal Tower, showing a man matching the scarred stranger's description withdrawing cash from a Joa Mensa's account using her stolen card. And beside him, unmistakably walking out of frame in a tailored coat, was Jung T6's personal driver. He's not just funding a corrupt contractor, Du Haiyan said grimly, freezing the footage. He's cleaning up loose ends personally. And Min Ho, if your father's old partner is willing to use his own driver to erase a missing cleaning woman, he is absolutely capable of trying to erase you too. Min Ho stared at the frozen image, at the driver's face he had seen a dozen times opening car doors at company events, smiling politely, utterly invisible in his ordinariness. The perfect instrument for a man who had spent 6 years learning exactly how to stay clean while everything around him got quietly, permanently dirty. Then we stop being polite, Min Ho said. We build the case Jung thinks no one is smart enough or brave enough to build, and Quame, he turned to the boy who had gone very pale watching the footage, you are the reason we even know where to look. Whatever happens next, that does not change. Quame nodded, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the frozen frame of the man who might have hurt his mother. Then let's find the rest of it, all of it. Outside the office windows, Seoul glittered on, indifferent and unaware that somewhere above its streets, a boy who sold paper cranes and a man who had almost died were quietly assembling the pieces of a conspiracy that powerful men had spent years believing would never see daylight, and neither of them intended to stop until it did. The following weeks unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, each discovery smaller than an explosion but building toward one. Du Haiyan brought in a forensic accountant named Yu Jun Seo, a soft-spoken man with a genius for numbers who could read a spreadsheet the way a detective reads a crime scene. Together, they traced ISIL Group's shell companies through the Philippines, Macau, and a string of dormant Korean shelf corporations, uncovering a pattern that went far beyond one missing cleaner. Jung's been siphoning construction contract kickbacks through Chinji and companies like it for at least 8 years, Jun Seo explained one evening, spreading printouts across Min Ho's dining table like a map of buried treasure. Underpaid, undocumented workers, many of them migrants with no legal recourse, cleaning buildings his companies win maintenance contracts for. When any of them ask too many questions or threat to report unsafe conditions, they simply disappear from the payroll. Sometimes from everywhere. Quame's hands were white-knuckled around his teacup. How many? Jun Seo hesitated, glancing at Min Ho, who nodded for him to answer honestly. At least 6 over the past 4 years. Your mother may not be the only one. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Quame stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring down at the city lights blurring through unshed tears, and Min Ho let him have the moment before speaking. This is bigger than revenge now, Min Ho said quietly. This is justice for people who had no one to fight for them. We're going to be the ones who do. Meanwhile, the sabotaged elevator investigation had quietly stalled at the police level. Reports misfiled, evidence inexplicably delayed, the scarred maintenance worker who'd been caught on camera and never located. It was Du Haiyan who noticed the pattern first. Every official channel that should have moved the case forward kept hitting soft, unexplainable resistance, the fingerprints of influence rather than incompetence. Someone with real power is protecting this from the inside, Du Haiyan said grimly, which means we can't hand this to the police yet, not until we have so much evidence that burying it becomes impossible even for Jung. Min Ho, who had spent his life building an empire on patience and precision, understood exactly what that meant. They would not confront Jung T-sik with accusations. They would bury him in undeniable proof, layer by layer, until the walls he had spent years constructing collapsed under their own weight. That night, as Quame finally drifted to sleep on the office couch during a late work session, Min Ho sat beside him for a long moment, watching the boy's face soften and rest for the first time in days. There was something unbearably tender in it, this child who had survived 2 years of invisible hardship, who had risked himself to save a stranger's life, who now slept safer than he had in months, because that stranger had refused to let him disappear back into the city's indifference. Min Ho did not yet have words for what he felt watching him. He only knew, with the same certainty that had built his company from nothing, that he would burn down every wall Jung T-sik had ever built before he let this boy lose anyone else. 3 weeks later, the evidence had grown into something undeniable. Falsified payroll records, offshore shell company trails, the pawnshop footage, and the breakthrough that finally cracked the case wide open, a terrified former Chinji Services supervisor named Mrs. O, who agreed to testify after Du Haiyan promised her protection. She had been present the night Ajoa Mensa confronted her supervisor about unpaid overtime and unsafe working conditions, and she had seen, through a half-open office door, Young T6 driver escort Ajoa into a car that never brought her home. "She's not dead," Mrs. O whispered, hands trembling around her tea in the safe house Du Haiyan had arranged. "At least, she wasn't then. I heard them say something about sending her back like she was cargo, not a person. I've been too afraid to say anything until now." Quame, listening from the next room where Min-ho had tried gently to keep him from the worst of it, pushed the door open, his face a storm of hope and fury. Where did they send her?" Mrs. O flinched at the desperation in his young voice, then softened. "I don't know, child, but there were papers. Deportation-style transfer papers forged, I think, for people they wanted gone without a trace, if those still exist somewhere in Isol's records." Min-ho was already reaching for his phone, calling Jun Seo. "I need every server, every backup, every filing cabinet connected to Isol Group's HR division, tonight, if possible." What they found 4 days later, buried in an unsecured backup server Jung's people had forgot still existed, was worse and better than anyone had feared. A spreadsheet chillingly clinical tracking a dozen resolved employee situations, a euphemism they realized with sick clarity, for migrant workers made to vanish, some through forced deportation to countries where their disappearance would raise no questions, and at least two, tragically, through means far more permanent. Ajoa Mensa's name appeared on the list with a single word beside it: relocated Ghana Accra facility, pending confirmation. Not dead, relocated, held possibly against her will, silenced by threats against the son she'd been forced to leave behind without a word. Quame read the words on the screen with his whole body trembling, and Min-ho, without thinking, without calculating the appropriateness of the gesture, pulled the boy into his arms and held him as the dam broke completely. "She's alive," Quame sobbed into his shoulder. "She's alive, she's alive." "We're going to bring her home," Min-ho said fiercely, his own voice unsteady for the first time in the entire investigation. "I swear to you, Quame, whatever it costs, we are going to bring her home." Outside, Seoul's skyline blazed on into the night, unaware that somewhere within it, a conspiracy built on the disposability of the powerless had just met the one thing its architects never accounted for. A boy brave enough to warn a stranger, and a man wealthy enough and now determined enough to spend everything he had making sure that bravery was rewarded with the truth. But truth, they both understood, was only the beginning. Young T6 still believed himself untouchable, and untouchable men, cornered, rarely go quietly. The next confrontation would not come from Min-ho's office or Du Haiyan's careful investigation. It would come, unexpectedly, 3 days later when Young T6 requested a private meeting with Kang Min-ho, smiling, composed, utterly unaware of how much his opponent already knew. Young T6 arrived at Hansol Tower dressed in the same immaculate charcoal suits he had worn to Min-ho's father's funeral 8 years earlier, carrying the same paternal smile that had fooled a grieving 26-year-old into believing an older man's guidance came free of self-interest. Min-ho had learned better since. He met Young in the executive conference room alone, though Du Haiyan sat 2 floors below monitoring an audio feed sewn into the room's light fixtures, and Jun Seo waited with a folder thick enough to end a man's freedom. "You've been unreachable," Young said pleasantly, settling into the chair across from Min-ho as though he had every right to it. "Missed board calls, cancelled meetings with D-sung. People are starting to wonder if the elevator incident shook you more than you're letting on." "It shook me," Min-ho agreed evenly, "though perhaps not in the way you're hopping." Something flickered behind Jung's eyes, so brief, so controlled, that a less observant man might have missed it entirely. Min-ho did not miss it. "Terrible business," Jung continued, smooth as ever. "Building maintenance is such a thankless, invisible industry, no one notices it until something goes wrong." "No," Min-ho said quietly, "no one notices it until someone goes missing either." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jung's smile did not waver, but his hands, folded on the table, went very still. "I'm not sure I follow." Ajoa Mensa, Minho said, watching every micro-expression cross the older man's face. Chinji Services, 6 months missing, presumed by police to have abandoned her post and her 12-year-old son, except her final paycheck was collected 2 weeks after she vanished by your driver at a pawnshop 3 districts from here. Jung's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't concern myself with the personnel matters of a subcontractor. A subcontractor you own, Minho said, sliding the first page of Junseo's folder across the table, through ISOL Group, through 2 nominee-directed shell companies, one of which is registered to an address that happens to be your late wife's childhood home in Busan. A nice, sentimental touch buried under enough paperwork that you assumed no one would ever look. For the first time in 8 years, Minho watched Jung Tae-sik's composure genuinely crack, not into rage, but into the colder, more dangerous stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he controlled. You've been busy, Jung said softly. I nearly died in an elevator you sabotaged, Minho replied just as softly. I've had motivation. Jung leaned back slowly, studying Minho with something almost like respect, the way a chess player studies an opponent who has, unexpectedly, seen 4 moves ahead. Your father would be proud of your instincts if disappointed in your recklessness. Do you have any idea what you're threatening to unravel? How many people, important people, have quiet arrangements woven through ISIL's contracts? That sounds like a confession, Minho said calmly, and only the faint, involuntary tightening around Jung's eyes confirmed it. It's a warning, Jung corrected, rising smoothly from his chair, his mask sliding back into place like a door closing. You have a great deal to lose, Minho, a company, a reputation, perhaps even people you've grown fond of in this sudden rush of philanthropic feeling. His gaze flicked, deliberately meaningfully, toward the door, and Minho's blood went cold with understanding. Jung knew about Quame. If anything happens to that boy, Minho said, his voice dropping into something Du Hyan would later describe as the most frightening calm he'd ever heard from his old friend, I will not need police or lawyers or evidence. I will simply make certain that every person you have ever hurt learns your name, your face, and your address, and I will let them decide what justice looks like. Jung paused at the door, considering this, and for just a moment the paternal mask slipped entirely, revealing something far older and far colder beneath it. You've changed, he said. Your father never would have made a threat he couldn't dress up as civility. My father, Minho said, never had a reason to. When Jung left, Du Hyan burst into the room within seconds, adrenaline sharp in his voice. We got it. Every word on record. That's not proof of murder, but it's proof of consciousness of guilt, and combined with the payroll trail. It's enough to force his hand, Minho said, already moving. But he just threatened Quame. We need him somewhere safer than this building, starting tonight. That evening, Quame was moved to a private, heavily secured residence Minho owned outside the city, accompanied by 2 of Du Hyan's most trusted former colleagues. He did not go quietly. I'm not hiding while you fight my mother's battle for her, Quame said, arms crossed, chin lifted in the exact stubborn defiance that had first made Minho notice him in the lobby weeks ago. You're not hiding, Minho said gently, crouching to meet the boy's eyes. You're staying alive long enough to see her again. That's not the same thing as cowardice, that's strategy. And Quame, I need you to trust me on this the way I trusted you in that lobby. Something in the parallel landed. Quame's shoulders lowered just slightly. Promise you'll call every night. Every night, Minho promised, until she's home. He did not yet know how close and how dangerous that promise would prove to be. Because 2 days later, Du Hyan's investigation would uncover something far darker than falsified payroll and quiet disappearances. Evidence suggesting Jung Tae-sik was not merely protecting a corrupt business scheme, but preparing with the same cold precision he'd used for years to make sure no one connected to Ajoa Mensa ever spoke again. And this time his target wasn't just Minho. It was the one person on Earth Ajoa Mensa had left to protect, her son. 2 days after the confrontation, Junseo called an emergency meeting at midnight. His usual composure cracked with urgency. I found wire transfer requests, he said, spreading a new set of documents across the table with shaking hands. Made yesterday, 12 hours after your meeting with Jung. Payments to an account linked to the same driver who withdrew Ajoa's paycheck, and a burner phone number that pinged twice near the private residence where Quame is staying. The room went silent with the particular stillness of people realizing danger has stopped being theoretical. He's found him, Du Hyan said grimly, already reaching for his phone. We move Quame now, not tomorrow, now. Minho was already standing, coat half on, his usual measured calm fractured by something raw and protective he didn't bother hiding anymore. "Call the safe house, tell them." His phone rang before he could finish the sentence. Du-hyun's contact, one of the two guards stationed with Quaim, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Sir, we have a problem. A car's been circling the property twice in the last hour. Same plate spotted near Hansol Tower on the sabotage footage." "Get him out," Minho said, already moving toward the elevator, ignoring every instinct that screamed at him about elevators now. "Back exit, second vehicle now, we'll meet you at the safe house in Ilsen." The drive across Seoul that night felt endless, the city's glittering indifference now a kind of taunt, every red light an eternity, every shadow a possible threat. Minho sat in the back seat with Du-hyun, both of them silent, both of them running the same calculations. How far would Jung Tae-sik go to protect 8 years of buried crimes? How much was one frightened, brilliant 12-year-old boy worth to a man who had already erased a woman for asking too many questions? They arrived at the safe house 11 minutes after the guard's emergency call to find the front door ajar, glass from a side window scattered across the floor, and the living room empty. Quaim was gone. Minho stood frozen in the doorway, the world narrowing to a single unbearable point of fear. And it was in that moment, staring at an empty room where a boy he had known for barely a month should have been, that he understood with sudden and total clarity exactly how much this child had come to mean to him. Not gratitude, not obligation, something closer to the ferocious, unconditional love of family chosen rather than given. "There," Du-hyun said sharply, pointing to a scrawled message on the fogged window, drawn hurriedly in a child's uneven hand before whoever took him could stop it. 3 characters, barely legible but unmistakable to anyone who knew Seoul's geography. A warehouse district. A place Du-hyun recognized immediately as one of Isol Group's older, mostly abandoned logistics properties. "He left us a trail," Minho breathed, something between terror and fierce, disbelieving pride cracking his voice. "Even now, even terrified, he left us a way to find him." "Then we don't waste it," Du-hyun said, already calling for backup, already dialing the one contact he had spent weeks cultivating quietly at the Financial Crimes Unit. A detective who had been waiting, patiently, for exactly enough evidence to move against a man too powerful to touch with anything less than certainty. That evidence, Minho realized grimly as they sped toward the warehouse district, they now had in overwhelming, undeniable abundance. What they didn't have yet was time. Somewhere in a dark, disused warehouse on the edge of the city, a boy who had once warned a stranger not to step into an elevator was now trapped by the very man that warning had ultimately exposed. And the only thing standing between Quaim and the same fate his mother had suffered was a Korean millionaire who had learned, in one impossible month, exactly what he was willing to risk for a family he hadn't known he needed. The warehouse district sat in near total darkness, its rusted logistics buildings hunched like sleeping giants against the Han River's black water. Minho's car screeched to a stop 3 blocks out, per Du-hyun's careful instruction, close enough to move quickly, far enough not to announce their arrival. Behind them, 2 unmarked vehicles carrying the financial crimes detective, Kang Seo-yeon, and 4 plainclothes officers pulled in silently, headlights already off. "We do this smart," Du-hyun said quietly, checking the small tactical flashlight clipped to his vest. "Jung's men are dangerous, but they're not soldiers. They're accountants and drivers who have never had to hold a line under real pressure. That's our advantage." Minho nodded, jaw set, every calculating instinct that had built his company now aimed at a single objective. "I want eyes on that building before anyone moves." Detective Kang, a sharp-featured woman with the unhurried confidence of someone who had waited years for a case like this, produced a small drone from her bag, its rotors nearly silent as it lifted into the darkness above the warehouse. On her tablet screen, thermal imaging revealed 3 figures inside the main structure, 2 standing near the entrance, 1 seated smaller in the building's rear office. "That's him," Minho breathed, staring at the small heat signature. "That's Quaim." Yeah. 2 guards, 1 likely armed, Kang said, studying the feed. "We go in through the loading dock on the east side. It's unmonitored. Quiet entry, contain the guards before they can react, extract the boy, no gunfire unless it's forced on us." Minho started forward and Du-hyun's hand caught his arm immediately. "Not you, you're not trained for this." "I'm not staying in this car while." "You're staying in this car," Du-hyun said firmly, "because if this goes wrong, Quaim needs someone alive who can make sure Jung Tae-sik never sees a free day again. That's not me, that's not Kang, that's you. Let us do our job." It was, Minho realized with a bitter, helpless clarity, the hardest kind of courage. the kind that required staying still while people he trusted walked toward danger on behalf of someone he loved. He nodded once tightly and watched four figures dissolve into the darkness toward the warehouse's east side. Inside, Quame sat rigid in a rusted metal chair, wrists zip-tied loosely, almost carelessly, as though his captors hadn't fully decided what kind of threat a 12-year-old truly posed. The scarred man from the elevator sabotage stood near the door, speaking in low tones to someone on a phone Quame recognized with a jolt of fury as Young T6's driver. "It just needs to disappear quietly the way his mother did," the driver was saying. "Mr. Young wants this clean, no mess, no." The warehouse's side door groaned open and everything happened at once. Du-Hyen's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, Detective Kang's voice sharp with authority, "Police! Hands where we can see them!" The scarred man's phone clattering to the concrete floor as four officers moved in with practiced, controlled speed. Quame flinched at the sudden noise and light, and then through the chaos saw a familiar figure vault past the officer's perimeter with a recklessness entirely unlike his usual composure. Min-ho, who had promised to wait, who had lasted exactly 90 seconds in that car before instinct overrode every rational argument, dropped to his knees in front of the boy, hands trembling as he tore at the zip ties. "You came," Quame gasped, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "I told you I would," Min-ho said fiercely, finally freeing his wrists and pulling him into an embrace that neither of them tried to make brief. "I told you every night until she's home, I meant it." Behind them, Detective Kang had the scarred man and the driver both in cuffs, reading rights that would echo through ISIL Group's carefully constructed empire within hours. The driver, faced with kidnapping and conspiracy charges he had no shell company sophisticated enough to hide behind, began talking almost immediately, the particular, self-preserving talking of a man who had never intended to go to prison for someone else's crimes. "Young ordered it," he said, voice shaking as Kang recorded his statement. "The kid, the elevator, all of it. He panicked after the meeting at Hansal Tower, said loose ends don't stay loose on their own." "And a Joa Mensa?" Min-ho demanded, still holding Quame close, unwilling to let even inches of distance return between them. "Where is she?" The driver hesitated, and for a moment Min-ho feared the worst kind of silence. Then, "There's a facility outside Accra. Jung has a partner there, runs it like a labor camp for people he needs to disappear quietly instead of permanently. She should still be alive if he hasn't panicked enough to change that." Quame's whole body went rigid against Min-ho's chest. "We have to get her, now, before he finds out we know." "We will," Min-ho said, and this time the promise carried the full, unshakable weight of a man who had just watched how close he'd come to losing everything, and had decided in that instant exactly what he intended to build instead. "Detective Kang, I need everything you have on international extradition and labor trafficking task forces. Tonight." Detective Kang, already dialing, gave him a look of grim, approving respect. "I was hoping you'd say that." Outside the warehouse, dawn was beginning to gray the edges of the sky over Seoul, and somewhere across the city, in an office he believed still safely his, Young T-sik was about to receive a phone call informing him that his driver had been arrested, and that the empire he'd spent 8 years quietly, patiently building on the disposability of the powerless had finally, irreversibly begun to collapse. But an ocean away, in a facility outside Accra that answered to no Korean law, Ajoa Mensa did not yet know that her son had just spent his freedom to buy her a chance at rescue. And Young T-sik's partner overseas, watching the same collapsing dominoes from a continent's distance, was about to make a decision of his own about how much longer she was worth keeping alive. The days following the warehouse rescue moved with a velocity that left Min-ho's entire company reeling. Detective Kang's arrest of Jung's driver triggered a cascade neither Jung nor his remaining allies could contain. The driver's confession, cross-referenced against Junseo's financial trail and Mrs. O's testimony, gave the Financial Crimes Unit enough probable cause to freeze every account linked to ISIL Group within 48 hours. Young T-sik, informed by his lawyers that a warrant for his arrest was being finalized, did not run, did not resist. He simply sat in his penthouse office, according to the officers who arrested him, staring out at the city he'd spent decades quietly bleeding, and said nothing at all when they read his rights. "Cowards fold quietly when the noise finally reaches them," Du-Hyen observed, watching the arrest footage with something like grim satisfaction. "It's the ones who threaten loudly beforehand who are usually the most afraid of consequences." But an arrest in Seoul meant nothing for a woman held in a facility outside Accra, and Min-ho understood that the most dangerous phase of this fight was only beginning. He spent 2 sleepless nights coordinating with Detective Kang, Interpol liaisons, and a Ghanaian anti-trafficking task force that Duhayan had painstakingly connected them with. Every hour waited by the driver's chilling warning that Jung's overseas partner might panic enough to change whether Ajoa Mensah stayed alive. Quaim, refusing to be shielded from any part of the process now, sat beside Minho through every call, every update, his exhaustion visible but his resolve unbroken. "She's strong," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone, during one of the long silences between updates. "She survived 2 years of people looking through her like she wasn't there. She can survive a few more days." "She won't have to survive many more," Minho said, squeezing his shoulder. "We're closer than you know." On the fourth day, word came through the Ghanaian task force that a joint raid, conducted at dawn local time, had located and secured the facility outside Accra. 11 workers rescued. Among them, a woman matching Ajoa Mensah's description, alive, malnourished, and initially too afraid to believe the officers weren't simply another layer of the same cruelty she'd endured for 6 months. When Detective Kang delivered the news personally, stepping into Minho's office where Quaim sat waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself not to hope too loudly, the boy's reaction was not the explosion of joy Minho had braced for. It was silence, long, disbelieving silence, and then a single, shuddering breath that broke into sobs so overwhelming Minho crossed the room without thinking and simply held him through it, letting 6 months of buried grief and fear finally, safely, come apart. "She's alive," Quaim finally managed. "She's really alive." "She's alive," Minho confirmed, his own eyes wet in a way he made no attempt to hide. "And in 18 hours she'll be on a plane home to you." The reunion, when it happened, took place not in some grand, cinematic airport arrival, but quietly, privately in a hospital recovery room where Ajoa Mensah, thin, exhausted but unmistakably, fiercely alive, opened her eyes to find her son standing frozen in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid this was another dream that would dissolve if he breathed too loudly. "Quaim," she whispered, and that single word broke whatever restraint remained in him. He crossed the room in 3 strides and collapsed into her arms, and for a long, wordless moment, neither of them needed to say anything else at all. Minho stood in the hallway, giving them privacy, and found Duhayan beside him, arms crossed, watching the reunion through the half-open door with an expression uncharacteristically soft for a man who'd spent a career hardened by other people's worst days. "You did that," Duhayan said quietly, "whatever happens with Jung's trial. Whatever headlines this becomes, that boy gets his mother back because you refused to walk away from a stranger who grabbed your sleeve in a lobby." Minho shook his head slowly, watching Ajoa press a trembling kiss to her son's forehead. "No, he did that. He saved my life first. Everything after was just me finally learning to pay attention to people the world had trained itself not to see." 3 months later, Jung T6 stood trial for conspiracy, human trafficking, attempted murder, and financial fraud spanning nearly a decade, charges built not on circumstantial suspicion, but on the overwhelming, meticulous evidence Minho Duhayan Junseo and Detective Kang had assembled layer by layer, witness by witness, until the walls he'd spent years constructing became impossible for even his most expensive lawyers to defend. He was sentenced to 22 years, and ISIL Group's remaining assets were seized, a significant portion redirected, at Minho's insistence, and to the astonishment of the business world, into a labor protection fund for migrant workers across Korea's cleaning and maintenance industries, ensuring no one like Ajoa Mensah would ever again vanish quietly enough for the world not to notice. Ajoa, recovering fully in the months that followed with medical care Minho quietly, insistently funded, eventually took a position overseeing that very fund, her first-hand understanding of exploitation making her uniquely, powerfully suited to ensure it never happened to anyone else the way it had happened to her. Quaim, meanwhile, enrolled in school for the first time in 2 years, no longer selling paper cranes in cold lobbies but studying, laughing, slowly unlearning the particular vigilant survival had once demanded of him, though Minho noticed with quiet tenderness that the boy never fully lost his habit of watching, of noticing small details others missed. Some instincts forged in hardship become gifts instead of wounds. On a warm evening nearly a year after that fateful morning in Hansal Tower's lobby, Minho stood on his balcony watching Seoul's skyline glow gold with sunset, Quaim beside him, Ajoa's laughter drifting from the kitchen where she and Ariam had become, unexpectedly, close friends. The boy who had once warned a stranger not to step into certain death now leaned comfortably against the railing beside the man who had, in gratitude, rebuilt both their lives. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Quaim asked quietly, "if you'd stepped into that elevator anyway?" Minho considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything now, not just business but the people in it. I think about it every day, he admitted. Not with fear, with gratitude. Because that morning taught me something I'd spent 34 years too busy to learn, that the people the world overlooks are often the ones paying the closest attention. You saw danger no one else noticed. You saved my life before you even knew my name. That's not luck, Quame, that's courage. Real courage, the kind that doesn't wait to be asked. Quame smiled, small and genuine, watching the city lights flicker on one by one across the darkening horizon. Mom always said one honest person paying attention can change everything. She was right, Minho said softly. It took one boy's warning to save my life, and it took one decision to listen, to believe him, to follow him instead of walking into what looked safe to save all of ours. Behind them, Ajoa's laughter rang warm through the open door, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future ahead held no shadows waiting to swallow it. Only the quiet, hard-won piece of people who had chosen courage over comfort, and found in the wreckage of what almost destroyed them an unexpected, unbreakable family. If this story moved you, remember its heart. The world is full of people paying more attention than we ever give them credit for, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply listen when someone tells us not to move.